Long before the blade descended, Marie Antoinette endured something far more sinister than execution. Her captors orchestrated a systematic campaign to dismantle her identity piece by piece, not just as royalty, but as a human being. The distance from Versailles' opulent corridors to a filthy prison cart wasn't merely a physical journey. It represented a deliberate effort to annihilate her spirit, her motherhood, her very essence. Yet somewhere in those final agonizing hours, amid orchestrated degradation, she discovered an unexpected reservoir of strength. This is how revolutionary France attempted to obliterate Marie Antoinette, and how she salvaged her humanity when everything else had been stripped away. The story doesn't start with glittering chandeliers or elaborate balls. It begins in the suffocating darkness of the conciergerie, a fortress prison grimly known as Death's Waiting Room. On the 2nd of August, 1793, after months confined with her family, Marie Antoinette faced a new horror. Under cover of darkness, guards dragged her away from her remaining children and sister-in-law, throwing her into solitary confinement. For the next 76 days, this dank cell would be her entire universe. Here, stripped of title and privilege, she became nothing more than prisoner 280. Her new accommodations were brutally small, perpetually damp, with moisture seeping through crumbling walls. A thin layer of straw served as her bed, but the physical discomfort paled compared to the invasion of her privacy. 2 guards stationed themselves inside her cell, maintaining constant surveillance around the clock. They monitored her meals, observed her dressing behind a pathetic makeshift screen, and studied her futile attempts at sleep. This wasn't standard security. It was calculated psychological warfare, a relentless reminder that her former life had been completely erased. The degrading conditions were harsh, certainly, but they couldn't compare to the emotional devastation she'd already endured. Just weeks before her transfer, Revolutionary Guards had burst in her chamber during the blackest hours of night. Their mission: to seize her 8-year-old son, Louis Charles. Witnesses described Marie Antoinette positioning herself as a physical barrier between the armed men and her child, her voice raw with desperate pleas. Her daughter Marie-Therese wrapped herself around her little brother, both children sobbing uncontrollably. The guards pried them apart regardless. That night marked the last time she would ever lay eyes on her son. All that remained were fragments: a miniature portrait and a small lock of his hair, both concealed against her heart in her undergarments. Losing her throne was merely symbolic. Losing her child destroyed something fundamental inside her that no guillotine could touch. Rosalie Lamerlier, the servant who stayed by her side through these nightmare months, later recalled that the former queen's composure only cracked when conversation turned to her children. Every other indignity, every verbal assault seemed almost bearable in comparison to that particular agony. As mid-October arrived, the final performance of her ordeal commenced. On the 14th, Marie Antoinette stood before the Revolutionary Tribunal. Calling it a trial would be generous. This was political theater, a predetermined conclusion dressed up as justice. Unlike her husband Louis XVI, who'd been granted weeks to prepare his defense, she received less than 24 hours. The accusations range from ridiculous to monstrous: embezzling state funds to Austria, conspiring to commit mass murder, hosting decadent orgies within Versailles walls. Then came the vilest charge imaginable, specifically engineered to destroy her character completely: sexual abuse of her own child. Revolutionary authorities had coerced young Louis Charles into signing testimony against his mother. The courtroom atmosphere thickened with tension as Marie Antoinette processed this accusation. The lead prosecutor, Antoine Quentin Fouquier-Tinville, a fanatical revolutionary, seemed to take perverse pleasure in this particular cruelty. For several heartbeats, she remained silent while the room hummed with anticipation. Then she stood, not to grovel or beg for mercy, but to face this final grotesque lie with a presence that stunned everyone assembled. Her response wasn't dramatic or pleading. It was surgical in its precision. She turned deliberately toward the public gallery, her gaze sweeping across the Parisian women who had previously screamed for her blood. In that singular, powerful moment, she reminded the entire world, that beneath everything else, she was a mother protecting her honor. The tribunal concluded swiftly. On October 16th, after barely 48 hours of proceedings, the all-male jury pronounced her guilty of high treason. The sentence, death by guillotine. When given an opportunity for final statements, Marie Antoinette simply declined with a shake of her head. Back in her miserable cell, she rejected the customary last meal. Speaking calmly to Rosalie, she said, "There's nothing I need now, child. Everything is finished for me." She then composed a devastating letter to her sister-in-law, begging forgiveness for her son regarding the forced testimony he'd provided. Revolutionary authorities intercepted the letter. It wouldn't surface for years. Dawn brought another carefully orchestrated wave of humiliation. Guards commanded her to remove the black mourning garment she'd worn continuously since Louis XVI's execution, a dress that symbolized both her status and her grief. They replaced it with a shabby white chemise, the clothing of a penitent sinner, not a monarch. She requested a moment of privacy, just a change. When her captors ignored this basic dignity, she initially refused to comply, a small assertion of autonomy on a day designed to strip her of any control whatsoever. The executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, along with his assistants, implemented further steps to erase her identity. An assistant roughly grabbed her hair, already turned white from relentless stress, and hacked it away with crude shears. This served dual purposes, symbolically stripping away her femininity and royal status, while practically preparing her for the guillotine's blade. They bound her wrists behind her with rope pulled viciously tight, causing genuine pain. Even the most basic bodily needs required explicit permission, forcing her to ask humbly for things once taken for granted. She was led to a rough wooden cart typically reserved for common criminals. Her husband had been afforded a closed carriage, but revolutionary authorities decided she deserved no such courtesy. Completely exposed to the fury and mockery of tens of thousands packed along the route, she would endure more than an hour-long procession through the heart of Paris. This public parade of degradation was meticulously designed to pulverize whatever remained of her spirit. Yet perched on that splintered plank, hands bound, encircled by waves of hostility, Marie Antoinette persisted. Every jarring movement of the cart, every hateful stare, every shouted insult tested her resilience, but she maintained her composure. She understood instinctively that these final hours would define her legacy far more than any fraudulent trial or brutal punishment ever could. The Queen of France had been stripped of her crown, severed from her family, expelled from her palace. But in that fetid cell and along the path toward the guillotine, the foundation of her final unbreakable dignity was already forming. Marie Antoinette's quiet resistance during this torturous journey foreshadowed a concluding, remarkable demonstration of courage that would astonish both executioners and spectators alike. The crowd's temperament was unpredictable, oscillating between vindictive satisfaction, raw hatred, and ghoulish fascination. Some celebrated, others spat in her direction, many simply gawked. Every curse hurled was another attempt to shatter her resolve before steel could finish the job. But with each violent lurch of the cart, each shriek from the masses, Marie Antoinette remained distinct, a solitary, composed figure, someone who had been stripped of everything material, yet somehow maintained her inner essence. This hour-long journey through Paris's streets was calculated to dehumanize her completely, to transform her into nothing more than a symbol of revolutionary victory over monarchy. Paradoxically, it also cemented her legend, not for her supposed excesses or political failures, but for the quiet strength, the unwavering dignity, and the maternal courage she demonstrated during her final public appearance. By the time the cart lurched to a stop at the Place de la Révolution, Marie Antoinette had survived an ordeal that would have destroyed most people. But as the guillotine's silhouette appeared before her, she recognized that yet another stage of humiliation awaited, a final examination of her composure, her bravery, and her humanity. Her story, however, wasn't approaching its end quite yet. That ultimate act, ascending the wooden steps toward the waiting blade, would reveal dimensions of her character that even zealous revolutionaries couldn't extinguish. Her capacity for grace under unimaginable pressure, her instinct for subtle defiance, and one last hauntingly human gesture that would reverberate through centuries. On that October day in 1793, the Place de la Revolution seethed with violent energy, a churning cauldron of rage, morbid curiosity, and bloodthirsty anticipation. At its center stood the guillotine, its wooden frame looming against the overcast autumn sky like a silent predator. The crowd surged forward like a living organism, tens of thousands strong, ravenous for spectacle, desperate to witness the fall of a queen who embodied everything they'd been taught to despise. Yet as the cart jerked to its final stop, something unexpected occurred. Marie Antoinette, systematically stripped of every luxury, every title, every conventional mark of dignity, refused to collapse. She descended with deliberate, measured composure. Witnesses who survived the revolutionary period later described her demeanor as calm, even elegant under the circumstances. Her hands remained bound behind her. Her hair, once an elaborate crown of carefully styled locks, had been crudely chopped away. Yet every insult screamed at her. Every jeer from the hostile crowd seemed to simply wash over her. The wooden steps to the scaffold waited before her. It would have been entirely understandable, even expected, to stumble, to shake uncontrollably, to cry out in terror. She did none of these things. Instead, she climbed independently, refusing the executioner's offered assistance, rejecting this final opportunity for subjugation. Each step upward became a silent act of defiance, a wordless reminder that while they possessed the power to end her physical life, they had failed to crush the core of who she was. Then came a moment so surreal, it almost defies belief. She accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot. Charles-Henri Sanson, the man who had severed her hair, bound her wrists, and now stood seconds away from releasing the blade that would end her existence, flinched visibly. The crowd's attention fixated on this unexpected moment, electric with tension. Marie Antoinette, showing not the slightest trace of fear, whispered a quiet apology. "Pardon me, sir. I did not mean to." That small gesture, occurring mere heartbeats before death, was extraordinary beyond measure. It was profoundly human. It was graceful, and it represented defiance in the only form that truly mattered anymore. She had preserved her dignity when literally everything else had been stolen from her. The blade would claim her life, but it could not touch her essential self. At precisely 12:15 in the afternoon, it happened. The guillotine's blade fell, swift, efficient, final. Sanson's assistant seized her severed head and raised it high for the crowd's viewing, prompting an eruption of voices chanting, "Vive la République." Her body was carelessly loaded onto a cart and deposited into an unmarked grave at a nearby cemetery. Even in death, authorities attempted to reduce her to the status of a nameless criminal, erasing France's last queen as though she had never drawn breath. But history possesses a peculiar power to preserve precisely what cruelty attempts to obliterate. Even after death, Marie Antoinette's story resisted silence. Among the macabre tales that followed her execution was that of a young artist named Marie Tussaud, summoned to create a death mask from the queen's severed head, a chilling testament to the simultaneous fascination and horror that Marie Antoinette inspired even in the immediate aftermath of her execution. More than 2 decades would pass before her story reached its final chapter. Following the monarchy's restoration in 1815, King Louis XVIII ordered the exhumation of his brother and sister-in-law's remains. Their clothing served as identification, and their bodies were finally given proper royal burial in the Basilica of Saint Denis, the traditional resting place of French monarchs. At long last, the queen who had been publicly humiliated and executed as a common criminal received the dignified interment denied to her in life. The French Revolution set out to destroy a symbol of extravagance and aristocratic excess. They subjected Marie Antoinette to every conceivable form of degradation: imprisonment in squalid conditions, the trauma of losing her children, a theatrical mockery of justice, public humiliation designed to break her spirit, and finally an execution meant to erase her very identity. Revolutionary authorities wanted the world to witness the death of a monster. Instead, they revealed a woman of remarkable resilience, unexpected courage, and stunning grace under pressure. Her final moments contained subtle acts of resistance that history continues to remember centuries later. The apology to her executioner, her refusal to break down, her composed bearing in the cart while tens of thousands hurled abuse, all served as demonstrations that even confronting ultimate cruelty, she could assert control over her final narrative. They could strip away her crown, her family, her freedom, her life. They could hack off her hair, force her into rags, bind her hands, and parade her through hostile streets. But they discovered, too late, that they could not erase the quiet strength, the maternal fortitude, and the haunting composure she maintained until her final breath. The guillotine was designed to be swift, brutal, and publicly humiliating, but it proved incapable of severing her story from historical memory. Witness testimonies, sketches produced by revolutionary artists, and later biographical accounts ensured that France's final queen would not disappear into obscurity. The image that endured wasn't of a debauched, heartless aristocrat, but of a mother, a prisoner, and a human being confronting mortality with extraordinary dignity. Even centuries removed from these events, her story continues to captivate audiences worldwide. It's not merely the violence of the French Revolution that people remember, but the manner in which she faced it. Dignity preserved, humanity intact despite everything. The world witnessed her execution, her systematic humiliation, the stripping away of everything she'd once possessed. Yet observers also saw something else, a quiet form of rebellion, an absolute refusal to allow hatred and terror to define her final moments. That final apology, a small, almost imperceptible gesture of basic human kindness, became powerfully symbolic. She could die, but she could not be truly destroyed. The legend surrounding Marie Antoinette extends far beyond excess or monarchy itself. It encompasses survival, grace under impossible pressure, and a human spirit's stubborn persistence in the face of deliberate dehumanization. Every cruel act, every calculated humiliation intended to diminish her instead illuminated the strength that remained fundamentally unbreakable. Even as the blade descended, her story refused to conclude with revolutionary violence. She transcended the sum of her misfortunes. She was a queen stripped to nothing, a mother grieving for stolen children, a human being meeting death with her humanity intact. And in that achievement, she left behind a legacy no guillotine could ever erase. France's last queen died exactly as revolutionary authorities intended. But in the hearts and minds of those who witnessed her final hours, and throughout the historical record that followed, Marie Antoinette remained something they could never touch, utterly herself until the very end. These are the stories where humanity persists, even when everything conspires to extinguish it.